Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to do this and share this program. I'm going to mostly read, only because I don't want to forget anything. But I just want to start out by saying, really, this is a two-part project. And I got into it deep and heavy. And I was like, I can't do this because I'll be there for like 3 hours. And nobody wants to hear 3 hours. So maybe there'll be a part 2 if you really want one. But it had to do a lot with Jane, her lines, her family lineage on both sides. And it was really getting me going. I was so excited, but I drew the line. So I edited it a little. Now, my orientation for up here and the computer is down there, so let's hope it goes smoothly. And I'm just going to start reading now. Again, thank you for the opportunity to shed light on the life of New Hampshire's only First Lady of the United States. Jane Means Appleton Pierce has remained in the shadows of history for more than 2 centuries, and what details were known about her discouraged exploration and dampened curiosity. Last year, Joan Davis called me, and she suggested that I consider creating a presentation on President Pierce's wife. I readily agreed and naively started down what turned out to be a challenging enigma. Why was Jane hiding? What was Jane hiding? Her position in life should have placed her center stage in the spotlight of history. Instead, she resorted to the shadows, where, for her, life was tolerable. But I was committed to the task, and thanks to Joan, after months of effort, I think this presentation will shed some light on the life of New Hampshire's First Lady. Okay, here's the orientation. All right, good. These many faces of Jane tempt us to draw conclusions about who she might have been. A young woman of society, a hopeful bride, the mother of a bright, promising boy, the gaunt, sickly woman, and the ever-grieving figure of a severe creator. Drawing Jane from the shadows in which she chose to dwell proved to be more of a challenge than one would think, especially given that she was married to a very public figure, Franklin Pierce. Her husband was gregarious, enjoyed the limelight, was brilliant and well-spoken. A successful lawyer and statesman, he was sought after, well-known and respected. From his own letters and those of his contemporaries, we know him as humble, thoughtful, and caring. History shows he was a family man and a patriot. Information about Franklin Pierce abounds. By contrast, very little is known about Jane. Franklin's wife was comfortable in the elusive cover that her poor health and retiring manner provided. But we want to know Jane, aside from her position as First Lady during the Pierce administration. Who was Jane Pierce? Early in my efforts to draw from the shadows, I set out to explore her world, people, places, and circumstances. Perhaps Jane would not be pleased with such scrutiny, but she has no say in it. And with this program, we are shedding light on the life of New Hampshire's First Lady. In searching the internet for details about Jane Pierce, I came across this painting by Tina Mayan. I wrote to Tina asking for details as to how she was inspired to create this rendition of the First Lady. And she replied to me and wrote the following, quote, Jane and Franklin Pierce had 3 sons. 1 month before Franklin's 1853 inauguration, they lost their last one, 12-year-old Benny, in a train accident before their eyes. Jane believed this tragedy to be God's way of providing her husband more time to devote to the presidency. For the next 2 years, Jane refused to come down from the second story of the White House, where she spent her days writing letters of apology to Benny. Jane kept a box with locks of hair of all her children. She called the locks of hair her precious ones. My painting, says the author, is how I imagine Jane, how she might have looked, unable to sleep, pacing the White House with her precious ones. End quote. Tina's painting of Jane was part of her series on America's First Ladies. And this project came about when Tina discovered that there was a deck of cards, playing cards, which featured the United States presidents and assigning each president a suit and a number. Franklin was designated with the two of diamonds for no special reason. But of course, when Tina decided to create the First Lady series, she used Franklin's number and suit. And so it's the two of diamonds. Drawing Jane from the shadows requires that one visit the world in which she lived. The people and circumstances in her world somewhat tell the tale of who she was, how she lived, and how she viewed life. The influences in her life no doubt colored her understanding of who she was. Her understanding of the faith she adhered to also dictated her response to the situations she faced, positive or negative. The influences of family created within her mind expectations and set a bar to which she must measure up in order to meet those expectations and standards as she understood them. Her immediate family members, their lives, their successes, their regard may have caused continual self-evaluation. Community, marriage, education, perhaps most strongly, death. All these factors had an influence on Jane, as they do on all of us. Disposition, strength, and personality may determine the response to such influences. As we bring Jane's life circumstances to light, perhaps she will at last herself emerge from the shadows. Surveying the life of Jane Pierce, one might conclude that writing her will was something she longed for, an act where her desires would hold sway, unlike the life over which she had no control. Soon she would close the door to misery and pain and enter her eternal reward. It is interesting to learn Jane's priorities as she contemplated leaving her earthly treasures. And a partial list of her bequests reads as follows. Number 1, the first item listed, the American Bible Society, $500. The American Foreign Missions Society, $100. The African Colonization Society, $100. Number 2, her sister Mary Aiken, $2,500. And to Mary's daughter, Jane Appleton Aiken, $500. To her niece, Jane Henshaw, $300. To her other nieces and nephews, $25 each. To Mary Aiken, again, a brooch with Benny's hair and Benny's gold pen. To Jane Appleton Aiken, a diamond cross worth $150. To her niece Frances, the gold bracelet that Franklin bought Jane in Rome. Let's see, wait a minute here. To others, she gave a hairpin, a Severs pin from France, an enameled gold bracelet, a pin containing her brother's hair. To the family servant, Mrs. Caldwell, an enameled pin containing her mother Elizabeth's hair. And finally, after others, Finally, Franklin. She leaves him all the residue of my estate. I love that word residue. I don't know. There is no mention of her Pierce nieces and nephews on Franklin's side of the family. Jane wrote the will August 17th, 1861, but she went on to live another 2.5 years until December 2nd, 1863. Still, one might feel that she found a measure of peace in completing this final task. Considering the list of deaths occurring in Jane's lifetime, we might observe that she was dressed almost consistently in black. She lived 57 years and lost 16 family members during her lifetime, an average of just over 3 deaths a year. And the mourning requirements were more or less stringent depending on the family relationship. Death was a large part of life for Jane. At 11 years old, she experienced the death of her little brother John in 1817, while the family was living in Brunswick. 2 years later, her father died after a long, slow decline in health. She witnessed him abide by a regimen so stringent, depriving himself of sufficient nutrition and rest. He slept only 4 hours a night, rose, and began his routine of writing, studying, teaching, etc. He developed what might have been a normal cold, but in his weakened condition, it appears that it settled in his lungs and he was not able to recover, but steadily grew worse until at death's door, he called each child to his bedside to deliver a final personal word to each. None on the list that her mother-in-law and her grandmother died in the same note on the list. Her mother-in-law and her grandmother died in the same year, as did her father-in-law and her sister. Jane is said to have been petite, with dark hair and eyes, and dressed in black. She must have been a morbid sight. Some mourning rules are found on the website under Psychology Today, of course. Death and mourning practices in the Victorian age. And the author Marilyn Mendoza writes, the dress dictated for practices in the Victorian age for women was uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Women were to be dressed completely in black, covered in crepe, which was a stiff, scratchy fabric. In addition to the uncomfortable crepe, women wore crinoline petticoats, also made of stiff fabric, which often caught fire when they were cooking. That's how Longfellow's wife died. Crepe was used extensively during the mourning period. It was draped across the door and hung on the doorknob. Stationery and cards were to have a black border representing crepe. Women were allowed to wear jewelry during the second phase of mourning. The rings, brooches, and lockets were often made from the hair of their deceased. In the Victorian era, no one would ever think of telling a mourner that they grieved long enough. Get over it. And Ian Smith in the Vintage News wrote the following quote, "Mourning was worn for 6 months for a sibling. Parents would wear mourning for a child as long as they felt the need. A widow was supposed to wear mourning for 2 years and was not supposed to enter society for 12 months. No lady or gentleman in mourning was supposed to attend social events while in deep mourning." In the portrait of Mary Aiken, if you remember seeing this online, it's a well-publicized picture, Jane's sister, Mary Aiken, was seen wearing essentially the same mourning gowns as Jane wears in her portraits. So many deaths from the time that she was young must have taken an emotional toll on Jane. But it is worth considering that the same topic in relation to Franklin, who himself experienced the heartbreak of lost loved ones, as this list shows. 3 of these deaths were those of his siblings, and they occurred prior to his marriage to Jane. Notably, his brother John Pierce died in Michigan just weeks after Franklin's graduation from Bowdoin. That means he was 20 years old. From this list, Franklin experienced the loss of loved ones, along with Jane, throughout their married life. He appears to have fared better in coping with the tragedy of death. And note, men only had to wear a black armband. Jane's father, the Reverend Jesse Appleton, was born in 1772 in the town of New Ipswich, New Hampshire. He was inaugurated as president of Bowdoin College in December of 1807. He received a degree of Doctor of Divinity from Dartmouth College and also from Harvard University. He was a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Historic resources are replete with narratives on Jesse Appleton. However, instead of quoting from any of those narratives, I will use some quotes by Jesse's own son-in-law, Alpheus Spring Packard. Packard was a student at Bowdoin when Reverend Appleton was president, and he later married Jane's sister, Frances. Alpheus Packard preserved Jesse's writings and sermons in 2 volumes, adding a preface that includes his own personal impressions of Reverend Appleton. So this helps shed light on the warm human emotions of Jane's father and of the man that some called the divine. Picking up on page 70 of Packard's book, Memoir in Works of Jesse Appleton, we read, quote, "His youngest child, a son of uncommon loveliness and promise, about 3 years old, was very suddenly removed by death. It was apparent that he was much shaken, Reverend Jesse was much shaken by this affliction. And as he stood at the graveside, surrounded by his family, the students of the college and his friends and his neighbors, his eyes streaming with tears, and his countenance betraying the anguish of the spirit within, his appearance attracted notice, and the deepest sympathy was felt for the Reverend." Then on page 71, Packard continues, showing the hurting parent. Quote, on the 19th of October, Jesse wrote, "Our dear son, a most beautiful, affectionate, interesting child, was snatched from our embraces in a very sudden manner. I love the very grave where his dear remains are deposited." This next passage on page 72 demonstrates his interaction with his children, quoting, "The conduct of his children toward him was, to an uncommon degree, the expression of the most devoted love combined with the highest respect. He made himself their companion and took a sincere interest in their pleasures and pursuits. The cares and the labors of his station did not prevent his interest in their pleasures and their pursuits. Superintending their studies, he instructed them much himself. His walks and rides with them were made no less seasons of improvement than delight. He took great pains to imbue their minds with useful knowledge, to inculcate the principles of a correct taste, to cultivate moral and religious feeling, and to lead them to the knowledge and acceptance of the Savior. He often retired with them for private conversation and prayer." Closing quote. And continuing from this book, pages 72 and 3, the next quote shows the important part that Jesse's wife played as the wife of a college president. Quoting, "He did not confine his affections to his own family. He was most fondly attached to his numerous connections. And at the same time that he enjoyed their unmingled respect and affection, his dwelling was an abode of generous hospitality. Strangers received every attention that true politeness and goodwill could dictate, and friends a heartfelt welcome. Seldom, may it be said, almost with literal truth, was he at his table without a guest. In the family circle or among his friends, his vivacity, which often became playfulness, his delicate humor, of which he had a large store, made him the most agreeable companion. That's her father. And honestly, I thought he was terrible. I was looking for all the things that would say, he was morose, he was serious, and I love these writings. So we must consider what pain Jane must have felt at the loss of a warm, tender, and loving father. Continuing on in the search for Jane, we pause to consider the profile of her mother. Elizabeth, Mrs. Jessie Appleton, was the third child of Robert and Mary McGregor Means. As the daughter of the town's wealthiest citizen, it would have been important for her to receive a fine education in order to attract an accomplished and worthy husband. After much digging through online resources, I came upon the fact that a group of leading men in Amherst and the surrounding towns took it upon themselves to found an academy in Amherst. Robert Means was among the academy's incorporators, called the Orion Academy. It opened in 1791 with a purpose declared to be to encourage and promote virtue and piety and a knowledge of the English, Greek, and Latin languages, mathematics, writing, geography, logic, oratory, rhetoric, and other useful and ornamental branches of literature. Elizabeth was 12 years old when the school opened, and it is safe to assume that she attended this school. Interestingly, her future husband, Jesse, who was 7 years older than Elizabeth, was the fourth schoolmaster at that school in Amherst. Let me find my place. Could he have taken an interest and noted the young student? Perhaps she excelled in her studies, or perhaps he met her through the schooling of her younger siblings, or through her father's involvement in the school, or at town functions. It is amazing to speculate such possibilities. And at any rate, Jessie and Elizabeth were married in 1800, 9 years after the school's opening. She was 21. He was 28. And we gained some insight into her personality from a profile sketch found in the book Amherst and Our Family Tree, which we have upstairs, by Anne Means. On pages 125 and 126, we read the following quote. Elizabeth, the second daughter of Robert Means, was born in 1779, and in 1800 she married the Reverend Jesse Appleton of Hampton, who afterwards became the president of Bowdoin College. When she was a girl, Elizabeth seems to have enjoyed the frivolous pursuits of the other young ladies in town. But in later life, she devoted herself solely to the severe aspects of her religion and to contemplation of the awful fate of those who died without due preparation for their eternal judgment. She was an earnest woman, end quote. But now consider Elizabeth as the hostess in their Brunswick home. As we read earlier, Elizabeth no doubt faced challenges as the wife of an accomplished and respected minister, writer, pastor, teacher, and college president. Add to that the heartrending struggles at the death of her 3-year-old son, John. Tragedy struck not long after that when she watched her husband waste away from grief and his taxing, self-imposed daily regimen of work and study. In an effort to avail him of better medical care and much-needed rest, Elizabeth and Jessie stayed at the home of her parents in Amherst for some time prior to his death. In 1819, just 2 years after John's passing, Jessie died at the age of 47. And Elizabeth was left a widow with 5 children, and she was 40. At this low point, Robert and Mary Manse made their farmhouse available to her. Elizabeth returned to her hometown of Amherst, where she and her family would find comfort and support. And keep in mind, Jane is living through and witnessing her mother's struggles while feeling herself the agony and the pain. When Jane was welcomed into the family, I got a little bug here, into the family of Jessie and Elizabeth Appleton, she was the couple's 3rd child with 2 older sisters. Mary Manse Appleton was 3 and Frances was 2. The family lived in Hampton, New Hampshire, where Jessie was pastor of the Congregational Church. He had accepted this calling in 1797, and he remained there until 1807 when he was inaugurated at Bowdoin College. When, on January 17, 1797, Jessie accepted this call from Hampton, he was single. The contract agreed to was meager. 90 pounds, whatever that British money was, a year in that first year. 20 pounds of that 90 was in provisions as follows: 3 shilling bushels of corn, pork, 3 pence, and beef, 2 pence a pound. The keeping of 1 horse, summer and winter. The second year, the same sum, keeping a horse and 2 cows, and also the provision of a convenient home and a barn if needed. Afterwards, 95 pounds annually to be paid in money and provisions as before, and they added 6 sheep and grass and hay for the winter, 5 cords of hardwood and 5 cords of pine wood. Jessie accepted the contract, which must have been in force when he married Elizabeth in 1800, and as it turned out, there was a dispute between 2 rival churches, Jessie's and the other, and the last pastor's wife, widow, refused to vacate the parsonage. So that was not settled until 1803, just in time for the birth of their first child. But the settlement required that 2 pastors share the home. How nice. Now, did these circumstances cause stress or tension? Do babies feel tension? Who knows? But Jane would not have known the circumstances long enough because her father accepted the call to Bowdoin when she was barely a year old. Jane would move with her family to the only home she would remember before Amherst. And at Bowdoin in Brunswick, Maine, the contract was more generous, and the living standards were better for president of the college and his family. The security gained in being part of a community and the influence of the community make it worthwhile to consider the 2 towns where Jane grew up. The contrast between the towns of Brunswick, where Jane had spent her formative years, and Amherst, where she grew into a young lady, are quite stark. Brunswick settled in 1717. It was part of Cumberland County, and the government seat was in Portland. In 1820, when Maine became a state, Brunswick population was 2,954, and the Maine Woolen and Cotton Company had 100 operatives at the time. And by 1806, stage coaches were making 2 trips a week into Brunswick, between Brunswick and Augusta. Bowdoin College brought many interesting people and families to the town, not to mention the brilliant students that would have frequented the Appleton home. By comparison, Amherst was founded 16 years later, in 1733. In the newly laid out town center, Jane's grandfather operated a mercantile business with a variety of goods. The population of Amherst in 1820 was only 1,622. And while coach service had begun between Amherst and Boston in the early 1800s, a stagecoach line operated through the town every day of the week by 1821. The town was largely agricultural. The community, and in this community, there were no factories or large businesses. New Hampshire became independent from Massachusetts in 1679, and Amherst was the Hillsborough County seat. Many lawyers settled there, and some of whom were family members, and some of whom were farmers. The household dynamics had certainly changed from one where students and associates were frequent visitors at the home to the one where, in Jane's home of Amherst, mostly only family visited. Keep in mind, she's 13, 14, when life is changing. Terrible time. The influence of a good and proper education figured strongly in Jane's family. As to her education as a young girl, we must consider both her years as a child in Brunswick and her years as a teenager in Amherst. What was her early education in Maine? In the New Hampshire Historical Society's publication, Historical New Hampshire, Volume 59, Jane Walter and Craig Paul Vensky opine on Jane's education in Brunswick, writing on page 46, quote, "It is likely that she received most of her early education from public schools in the Brunswick area, from her father, from her mother, perhaps from some of the Baudouin scholars that her father tutored," end quote. But with the family's move, what schooling did she receive in Amherst? Reading on in Vensky's article, her mother's June 1820 letter to Mary Mason indicated that Jane, William, and Robert were attending school. Elizabeth was no doubt referring to the public schools in Amherst, which traditionally prepared students up to the age of 14 or 16. So with Jessie's death and the family's move to Amherst, to a 13-year-old girl, the new surroundings, new friends, new teachers must have been difficult. Jane's father and grandfather were positive factors in her favor and helped to make her a strong prospect in the estimation of young suitors. But Elizabeth knew this would not be enough to attract a good match and a lifelong partner. Jane would need the training and credentials offered by a school for young ladies. Her family chose Miss Catherine Fisk's seminary. Here is what we know about this well-respected establishment. Miss Catherine Fisk's Young Ladies Seminary was a boarding and a day school for young ladies. Housed in what today is the President's House at Keene State College, it was established in 1814 and achieved a national reputation. Fisk School was the first of its kind in New Hampshire and the second school of its kind in the country. In 1823, about the time when Jane was at the school, there were 84 pupils enrolled. Miss Fisk was ahead of her time in teaching the science of cooking. Having oversight of the culinary concerns herself, she taught her pupils the useful employments of the household in which she herself took a scientific interest, including even chemistry of making bread. She demonstrated the astronomical and mathematical calculations of Isaac Newton. Beyond that, instruction included reading, writing, English grammar, composition, arithmetic, history, and geography with the use of maps and globes. Courses in the finer arts included drawing, painting, and various media, plain and ornamental needlework, and music. Strict attention was also paid to the improvement of the young lady's morals, manners, and minds. And I think most of us might agree that some of that is worth keeping today. I don't know. Could use a little more. Today, this regimen appears tedious. But at the time, Jane would have submitted to it knowing it was an important step in her formation to make her fit for a suitable match and a propitious candidate. With all her learning, it appears that Jane enjoyed her music lessons. Jane's sister Frances settled in Brunswick, Maine, where her husband was on staff at Bowdoin. In 1828, she writes to her brother William, quote, "I believe Mary mentioned to you that Jane has left us and spent the summer in the city of Boston. The piano stands quite still. She is taking lessons of Mrs. Fish in Boston and will improve there very much, probably." We know that Uncle Amos bought a piano for Jane. How much she enjoyed playing it over the years, we don't know. But playing the piano was a valuable refinement to add to her resume. With her formal education ended, Jane's mother has prepared her daughter well. She's ready to step onto the social stage. With an example of her father, her brother, and her brothers-in-law, she no doubt narrows the field in her mind. The males in Jane's family and in her background were ministers, lawyers, merchants, all of them well recognized, all from respectable families, all hardworking and strong, all tender and understanding, all good providers. And if he was handsome, so much the better. These are the traits she would look for in a potential husband. On their side, the potential suitors no doubt had their checkoff list on their own, with qualifications for a lifelong partner, a wife who could oversee the affairs of his home, carry on worthwhile conversations, respect and hold his values, enable him to get ahead, rear his children well, and if she was pretty, so much the better. Jane's family had prepared her well to meet the highest standards, and at this young age, her physical attributes were a bonus. Anne Covell, on page 73 of her book on the life of Jane Pierce, quotes author Whitten's description of Jane as small, light, graceful, with large dark eyes gazing out directly under a wide forehead, marked with arching eyebrows. Her hair, parted plainly in the middle, was brought down in smooth-lying ringlets, softening the line of her cheekbones and covering her ears. Yet, Jane's background, education, demeanor, and appearance were not the whole story. Jane had lived for years with chronic health problems that were a source of worry to her family members, whose correspondence seldom failed to express concern for her health. It is certain that she did not feign illness, for her family members could see for themselves that she was not well. They saw that she tended to be despondent and depressed. They heard the coughing, saw her listlessness. They knew of her vomiting. There was no medical diagnosis, and the usual treatments of the time offered no cure. Jane was described as shy, but one wonders if her retiring manner was actually a convenient cover, helping to hide her miserable stomach and digestive problems. Some speculate that the unreasonable and unhealthy fashions of the day, requiring women to wear tight corsets that inhibited their lung function, was to blame. This no doubt exacerbated her condition because the flow of oxygen to and from the lungs into the bloodstream is vital to overhaul all health. But given that her mother, sisters, aunts, and virtually all stylish women wore the same fashions and did not regularly display such symptoms, one might be led to conclude that there was more to her poor health than a tight corset. Another cause for questioning her ailments is how they seem to be more or less prevalent depending upon the circumstances. She might be able to avoid certain company or particular event or requirement if she were not feeling well. Her health seemed to improve whenever she stayed at her sister Mary's, where she spent inordinate amounts of time during her married life. She was happy and healthy when Franklin was home. It seems that when things were to her liking, Jane had no real physical complaints. This may have been an example of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did Jane feel sick because she was nervous, or did she feel nervous because she was sick? It is also worth noting that Jane may have had another reason for what might have been chronic nervousness and for resigning herself to it. Jane's father, Jesse Appleton, adhered strongly and taught the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination. This article of faith was inculcated in his children so that Jane grew up with a view that a loving, fatherly God must sometimes use harsh and painful measures in order to perfect his children. This was how Jane would cope with sickness and death. She could try to avoid God's correction by living a holy life, but inevitably, as an imperfect soul, she was bound to trespass and require his correction through small and large painful circumstances. A condition such as chronic poor health might be the Creator's way of keeping her humble. One must trust God's work, not question his wisdom. All these factors formed the influences that played in Jane's life. Whatever the case, Jane knew the requirements of the day, and the expectations of her family were that she find a suitable mate and fulfill the social duties and success as a successful woman. She set her sights, if not her heart, on the handsome up-and-coming lawyer, Franklin Pierce. Franklin qualified as the ideal, though perhaps not perfect, prospective husband. Jane's family did not approve of him and discouraged the union. His credentials were impeccable to a degree. He was the son of a much-respected Revolutionary War veteran and former two-term New Hampshire governor. He had graduated at the top of his class at Bowdoin College, where Jane's father had been president. He had passed the bar and was rising in the legal profession. He was a recognized leader, having served as the town moderator 5 times. He was a state legislator and the Speaker of the New Hampshire House, a member of the state militia, and he was good-looking. He is described by Horatio Bridge, a college acquaintance, as, quote, slender, of medium height, with a fair complexion and light hair, erect with a military bearing, and always bright and cheerful. In character, he's impulsive, not rash. Generous, not lavish. Chivalrous, courtly, manly, and warm-hearted. Franklin did not like bachelorhood, and he longed to be married. He wanted the companionship and affection of a wife. Do we think he got that? And a home to return to at the end of the day. He was drawn to Jane. Somehow, despite his busy schedule between politics and his legal career, he pursued a relationship with Jane. At last, putting aside their initial censure, the family saw his promise. And by 1832, they began to develop a more positive impression of Franklin. They were engaged in 1833, just before his election to the House of Representatives, the youngest to ever hold that office. They decided to wait until he had settled into his duties in Washington, setting their wedding date at the end of the following year, 1834. In preparing for married life, Franklin bought a house in his native Hillsborough. Finally, the day arrived, November 1834, and the wedding ceremony took place without much to do. Jane wore a traveling suit, and that one pictured actually is in the archives of the New Hampshire Historic Society. She has a coat on there, but there's a full dress underneath it. But you can see it's hardly a gown. It was a traveling suit at the time. In the absence of her father, Jane's brother Robert escorted her to the parlor at the Means home where the ceremony took place. The couple left for Washington immediately afterwards, and with that, Franklin and Jane started married life together. Has everybody here, or let's ask this, has anybody here not been to the town of Amherst? Like you've never seen the town? So you all pretty much know, right when you turn in that beautiful town center, you're thrown back in the centuries, really. But her grandfather had the first house on your left when you turn right off in the main road there. Her grandfather had that first house with the fence around it. And attached to it in the back, where now it's kind of like, it's just a joining area. But that's where he had his mercantile store. So that's where they were married. How two people so different from one another could be attracted to each other is hard to understand. Why Jane was attracted to Franklin, one can see, given the list of qualifications considered earlier. And Franklin appears to be simply a young man looking to share life and love with a soulmate. From the beginning, Jane gave vent to her dislike of Franklin's political career. Their first trip to Washington as a new bride left her miserably unhappy. Jane didn't like the boarding house. She didn't like the Capitol. She didn't like to socialize with the wives of the other representatives. She stayed in her room, not feeling well. Things did not get any better. She avoided traveling with Franklin when the House was in session, and perhaps Jane found in Franklin someone who met the requirements of a good match on paper, but the political aspect of his career she could not endure. What was there about Jane that drew Franklin to him? Jane met all the criteria for a good wife on paper. That was true. But perhaps it was not so much about what was about Jane that attracted Franklin as what Franklin was that drew him to her. Franklin Pierce was a tender and a good-hearted person, and Franklin had a soft spot for the underdog. Consider a few of his actions that demonstrate this characteristic. In 1828, his brother's widow died suddenly in Michigan. Franklin immediately left to bring his two young nieces back to New Hampshire to be raised with the Pierce family. And some years later, Franklin wrote to that little girl when she was 16, quoting, "Your health being delicate requires great care. Medicine and exercise is of no avail against an irregular diet. Whatever you do, let it be done gracefully and with ease. Among your studies, do not neglect the Bible." What a good uncle, huh? And he really didn't know them. They were born in Michigan. He never knew them, and he went out there and picked them up. That was a good guy. He defended the Shakers and Mary Baker Eddy in their legal challenges for just small fees. He was instrumental in securing the release of Jefferson Davis from prison after the Civil War, and Davis had been his Secretary of War. It is said that Franklin's influence in Concord made way for the Catholic Church to establish itself in the community. And there's one instance of his literal interaction with small dogs. If anybody here knows this story, I'll eat my shirt. Here one. Pierce, as president, successfully opened trade relations with Japan, a major coup, as since Japan had refused to entertain trade prior to this and had in fact closed its borders to foreigners back in 1683. So when U.S. Representative Commodore Perry returned to the States after the successful signing of the treaty, he brought gifts to Pierce from the Japanese. Among the gifts were 7 teacup-sized dogs, possibly known as Japanese chin. They were highly valued by the Japanese. They were toy-sized dogs, and in the late 1800s they were called a sleeve dog, so named because they could fit up the sleeve of a kimono. They were so small that they could scamper around a coffee saucer. President Pierce kept one dog and gave the others to friends. Little more is known about the dogs, but one thing is sure. For such small dogs, they won over some very important men and represented a major trade accomplishment for Pierce. Pierce was a strong, gregarious, and charismatic leader in every avenue he pursued. In college among friends, in his political career, in his legal career, in his military service. In my research, in the letters I perused in Wallner's biographies, he is never accused of being prideful, overbearing, or conceited. He proved to be a loving, devoted, tender, and concerned husband. One letter in particular breaks my heart, and it's worth reading. But look, everything blue he carried in the election. He was loved. And he's from New Hampshire. Here's the letter. So this letter shows so much of the tenderness of Franklin and of Jane's neglect of her husband. Now, this is for me the biggest heartbreak and tragedy of the household. It demonstrates that. Okay. Jane, oh, wait, sorry, I think I jumped. Yeah, I did. Hold on. Written on June 11th, 1849. The letter reads, you can't see it, but, Dearest Jeannie, that's what he called her. I looked for a line from you on Saturday, and again today, at 11 and 3. I trust this evening's mail may bring a letter instead of disappointment. I found so many engagements demanding my attention. It has meant that I could not leave to attend Robert's wedding, her brother's, which I regretted. I wrote him a note yesterday expressing my regrets. Our office has been literally full all day, and I look for no leisure for a long time to come. I have heard nothing new as of the sudden death of Mr. Gilchrist, who occupied rooms, as you will remember, at Mrs. Lincoln's. His death was occasioned a week ago, last night, by taking, it is believed, by mistake, a large quantity of laudanum. It was, of course, a very disturbing announcement to his mother, the judge, and the family. I hope you and Benny are well, dearest, and that you may continue to improve till we meet. I will meet you at Lowell whenever you're ready to come home. All well at the Stevens, and the house is much improved by paint, etc. Tell dear Benny that Father sends his love and expects him to be a very good boy. Love to Mary. In haste, your affectionate Franklin. There's another letter I wrote. I could fill your walls. There's another letter I read that was from him to her again. Dearest Jeannie. And this one, he's like all apology. You know, I didn't get to write before this. I was out in my father's field. He's out there doing work in the field. And he even says, I came in sweating. You know, and you can see it, you know, but that's not his primary job. I mean, he's a husband, and he has a legal practice. All this going on, and he's got to write to her, apologizing. Sorry, folks. Are you getting the picture? So now we come to what were, no doubt, the biggest heartbreak and tragedy of the Pierce household, the deaths of their 3 children. Jane delivered her first child at her mother's home in Amherst when Franklin was serving in Congress, and he was away in Washington. Jane had spent the last few weeks of her pregnancy with her mother. Franklin Pierce Jr. survived only 3 days and was buried by the time his father arrived. Franklin, it seems, often wore his heart on his sleeve, and in a letter to his sister Elizabeth he wrote, quote, "He who has lived 30 years in this world of ours, seen its vanity, felt its misery, ought not to repine or weep over the demise of an infant. But alas, what has our experience or what has our philosophy to do with the feelings of a father?" The 3-year interval between the death of Franklin Jr. and the birth of Frankie must have been spent in hopeful anticipation. Jane was 33 when their second son was born, this time in Concord. The boy was a joy to the couple, and in one letter to her mother, Jane writes of how his nursemaid rejoices at his fat legs. The little family was then living in a boarding house in New Hampshire's capital city of Concord. Then, 2 years later, the joyous birth of another child occurred when Benny was born. Franklin bought a house not long after his birth, and the couple embarked on what were to be the happiest years of their marriage in this house. The boys were growing into happy, healthy, active toddlers. Franklin was out of politics. The family was together on the Montgomery Street home, but tragedy visited Jane again. The dreaded deadly disease of typhus struck the boys, and their condition was precarious as they struggled with diarrhea, vomiting, dangerously high fevers. At last, Benny began to recover, but 4-year-old Frankie succumbed to the disease and passed away in an upstairs bedroom. Of Frankie's passing, Jane's sister wrote, quote, this is Mary writing, "He scarcely breathed as I entered the room. All consciousness of suffering had left him, apparently for more than an hour. For 4 days, part of his disorder has preyed on his lungs, and there have been days and nights of anguish, so that his heart-stricken parents rejoiced to see him now at rest. Mr. Pierce is bowed with anguish." She doesn't say anything about how Jane felt. That's okay, because Jane knew why that happened. With her faith doctrine as a loving father, with her faith doctrine of God as her loving father, Jane trusted that Frankie was at rest with the Creator. And now her focus was completely on Benny. And he worked on Benny's thriving, and she worked long hours on that. Still, their home was happy, and Jane was satisfied. Suddenly, the unexpected came, and Jane's world went reeling once again as war was declared, and her husband enlisted without hesitation. In March of 1847, he left for Mexico, and when he returned to a hero's welcome, he was still limping from a battlefield injury. Jane, who had spent most of that time in Andover with her sister, now found their home filled with sad memories. The house was sold, and they moved into a fashionable boarding house at the south end of Main Street. It seems that Jane could not escape tragedy, and once again she would be the victim to the loving wisdom of God. So now we're going to hurry up and get to the end of the story. Without too much detail, we will tell of Franklin's election to the presidency of the United States in 1852 and the subsequent tragedy after the initial shock at learning of Franklin's election. Jane was persuaded, finally, that his high office would open doors of opportunities to Benny as he grew up. For the next 4 years, Benny would be exposed to world events, have the best teachers, enjoy wonderful experiences. The family made plans for the move, and Franklin and Jane arranged to have her Aunt Abigail to the White House with them to be a support for Jane and to bring a measure of comfort in her unfamiliar circumstances. The day after New Year's Day, 1853, just weeks away from Franklin's inauguration, as the little family traveled by train from Andover to Concord, the train derailed, the passenger car careened and rolled down the embankment, and Benny was thrown from his seat and killed instantly. And this is the sad note upon which we began the story of all those sad things in Jane's life. The end. What do you think? Not too bad. Thank you all for your attention. I'll turn it back to you, Jane. Joan.